Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Stephen A. Cook, prominent Turkey watcher and senior fellow for the Middle East and North Africa at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Oh, it's my great pleasure to be back with you.
We are talking on Thursday, December 19th, 2 days after the U.S. Senate passed a defense bill that calls for sanctioning Turkey for its purchase of Russian-made S-400 missile defenses. Do you expect these sanctions to be levied? And if so, which sanctions do you expect? Will any target Erdogan, and might they seriously damage the Turkish economy?
Yeah, I think this is the big debate that's going on in Washington. Thus far, the president has avoided applying sanctions to Turkey through the CAATSA legislation by just basically ignoring it. Yet now that sanctions are folded into the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization, it is going to be much harder for him to ignore this. So the question is how targeted will these sanctions be? And I think that the feeling among folks within the foreign policy community is that the sanctions do in fact need to be targeted. They do need to be targeted at the people and the entities that have facilitated the transfer of the S-400, that it needs to be targeted against people who are continuing to facilitate significant military purchases from the Russian Federation. The president, though, seems determined to avoid taking this step. So it may very well be that he signs the NDAA, and we still have a situation in which the president is prevaricating on imposing sanctions that the Congress has instructed him to apply. And the CAATSA legislation is actually pretty clear. It says the president shall apply sanctions. The congressional language generally doesn't get much stronger than that. Everybody knows what it means. Nevertheless, the president has let this thing hang out there for many, many months.
So would he be, I thought it said that he had to apply them within 30 days of signing it or something like this. Wouldn't he then be in breach of something if he didn't apply them, if he just ignored it?
Well, again, he would be in breach. But what the question is, and the question that I posed to my friends on Capitol Hill is, what tools do they have to compel the president if the president doesn't do? And what they really have is they have a blunt instrument. They can defund things that are important to the president, but I think it's going to be a very tough road to get bipartisan support to do that on something regarding Turkey. Now, it is true that Turkey's actions, everything from the S-400 to Operation Peace Spring, has actually generated bipartisan support for punishing Turkey on Capitol Hill. But to take the next step, to seek to defund programs or agencies even that are important to the president in order to compel him to apply sanctions, is something that I doubt the Democrats will want to do, and I doubt the Republicans would go for as well, as angry as people are at Turkey right now.
On Monday, Turkish President Erdogan threatened to respond to possible U.S. sanctions by shutting down Incirlik Air Base, which, of course, has a U.S. military presence and is also where the U.S. keeps its nuclear missiles. Assuming these sanctions do happen at some point in the coming months, do you see Turkey responding this strongly?
Well, it's unclear to me. I'm beyond predicting what leaders are going to do. But I think it should be clear by now to people in Washington that those of us who have been saying, well, we don't need to leave Incirlik, but we actually need to develop alternatives to Incirlik should we be barred from it, that this is now should be a live conversation in D.C. This is something that's been kicking around. Michael Koplow and I raised it. Jonathan Schanzer and some colleagues from FDD also raised it a couple of years ago. This is when the Turks were threatening the U.S. presence in Incirlik, threatening to shut down the U.S. there because of its cooperation with the YPG. And it seems to a variety of analysts that giving the Turks the ability to basically put the United States over a barrel on Incirlik was not a good way to pursue American foreign policy. And that while Incirlik is perfectly located, there are other places from which the United States could operate that could easily achieve the job. and we wouldn't be subject to Turkish blackmail. The complicating factor is, as you note, is that the United States has dozens of nuclear bombs stored at Incirlik as a symbol of America's commitment to Turkey's security. And removing those is more than just loading them up on an airplane and taking them out. It is from what I understand, I'm not, a guns and trucks and nukes guy, but from what I understand, it is a much more involved procedure than that. And from what I understand, there already have been discussions between officials at the State Department and the Department of Energy about how to accomplish this. There's even some rumors in Washington that some of those weapons have already been removed. But the Turks have raised the issue enough, and the stakes are high enough that if one can imagine, and this should be one of the possible outcomes, one can imagine that if the U.S. sanctions come about, and and Erdogan has made a big deal of retaliating in this way, it would be hard for him politically not to do it. But of course, there's continued communication between the two governments, so there is always a way to avoid this outcome, which is a tough one. These relations between the two countries are deteriorating rapidly.
The defense bill included a provision that ends the U.S. arms embargo on Cyprus. On Twitter last week, you highlighted the massive military imbalance in the Eastern Mediterranean, pointing out how Cyprus doesn't even have a boat to monitor the movements of Turkey's drilling and naval vessels in the area. I wonder if you think that the United States might now help address this imbalance.
Well, having recently been in Cyprus and visited the Cypriot Ministry of Defense, which is which building is about the size of the Council on Foreign Relations building in Washington, D.C., which is either the Council's building is too big or the Cypriot Ministry of Defense's building is way too small. But there is an extraordinary imbalance. Turkey has the second largest military in NATO, a sophisticated force. Turkey has the ability to manufacture even its own weapon systems, and Cyprus literally doesn't have a boat to go out there and even look at what the Turks are doing in what Cyprus claims to be its exclusive economic zone. It doesn't have radars. It doesn't have the full panoply of things that it could even try to defend itself, even for a short period of time. And of course, the Turks have been, it seems to me, needlessly aggressive over this issue of gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. All of the actors there would love to have Turkey to be involved in it, but for Turkey's, I think, again, needlessly aggressive posture towards the Egyptians, towards the Israelis, and towards the Republic of Cyprus, and of course, Greece. The Congress, I think, feels very strongly at this point, given the state of relations between Turkey and the United States, that perhaps revisiting and lifting this embargo on the Republic of Cyprus is something that's worthwhile doing. They find a very skittish State Department. The State Department does not want to rock the boat any further with Turkey, and can be expected to lobby Congress against this, arguing that lifting this embargo will infuriate Turkey and push them towards the Russians and perhaps the Iranians. The counter argument to this is how much further can they go with the Russians and the Iranians, and that an opening to Cyprus is potentially a strategic benefit to the United States, because it would obviate the need to rely only on Incirlik. Cyprus is quite well located for a variety of American contingencies in the Eastern Mediterranean, two of which are containing a growing Russian presence and a potential Chinese presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. So this is going to be, I think, a further discussion and a fight on Capitol Hill. But I suspect that most of the arguments for maintaining the embargo on Cyprus are not going to get a tremendous hearing from members of Congress at this point. Pardon me.
We'll get to Russia and Turkey in a minute, but speaking of Turkish aggression in the Eastern Mediterranean, last month, Turkey and Libya signed a controversial deal on maritime borders. as
Yep.
you well know, I'm sure, undercutting claims made by Greece and by Cyprus and significantly increasing regional tensions. I spoke to a former Turkish diplomat and expert on maritime law yesterday who said the deal is not legally binding, but mainly serves to expand Turkey's claim from about 150,000 square kilometers to the current 190,000. And he thinks that Turkey just found itself partnered with a friendly government in Tripoli and seized an opportunity to improve its negotiating position, and probably promised further support to Tripoli in return. I'm wondering, is that how you think Turkey came to make this deal with Libya? Because to me, it seemed to come out of the blue.
Right. I think there's a couple of things that are driving the Turkish government on this, and everybody wants to pile on the Turks, and I guess I'm included in that group. But I do, if you do look at the map and you look at what is going on in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's hard, given from where Ankara views things, to not believe that Turkey is sort of being surrounded in its maritime, its ability to maintain, its freedom of navigation in the Mediterranean, which it has a huge border with the Mediterranean, that
Sure.
It's going to be constrained.
Israel, Greece, on each side, yeah.
Right, and that it will, as a result of the Israel, Cyprus, Greece, Egypt, Lebanon development of this consortium, for lack of a better term, in the Eastern Mediterranean that is ostensibly over gas, but also has clearly has a security component, implicit though it may be, that the Turks fear that they will be constrained in the Mediterranean. That is, I think, anybody fairly looking at the map can see that. Then there's no secret that the Turks are engaged in a proxy fight in Libya. And they're, arch rivals. The Egyptians and the Emiratis have been supporting General Khalifa Haftar, along with the French, who have difficult relations with the Turks. The Russians, which is interesting because it puts the Turks and the Russians on opposite ends of a conflict. And that the loss of Libya to Emirati and Egyptian influence would be, in the kind of game that's being played out in the region, would be a strategic setback for Erdogan. And then, of course, the other reason is Erdogan dispatching troops and demonstrating leadership and a principled policy. Sarraj leads a government that is the internationally recognized government, as opposed to Khalifa Haftar, who is this renegade Qaddafist general who was at one time a CIA asset. He can present what Turkey is doing there as the responsible thing that a responsible power in the region and a leader of the Muslim world should be doing. Again, though, it is potentially destabilizing. Egypt considers Libya to be its backyard, and given the state of relations between Egypt and Turkey, especially since the coup d'etat that brought Abdel Fattah Sisi to power, and the fact that the Turks welcomed the Muslim Brotherhood to Istanbul and have from there have sought to delegitimize Sisi, it just more than irritates the Egyptians. The Egyptian sense of threat about Turkey and Turkey's support for Islamist groups is rather acute. It extends from the Sinai, though there's really not a lot of evidence that the Turks have been involved in the Sinai, but certainly clearly in Libya. And so it's likely to escalate tension there. And to be quite honest, Libya is far from Turkey. It's not northeastern Syria. It's not the Aegean. It's not Cyprus. So I think there's plenty of risk there for Erdogan. But again, I think the Turkish diplomat that you spoke with is hitting on something that I think the Turks are interested in, is negotiating a better deal. They would be putting themselves in a better position if they weren't seen as needlessly aggressive on a variety of issues in and around the region.
Yeah, as you mentioned, after meeting the Government of National Accord leader Fayez al-Sarraj in Istanbul on Sunday, Erdogan said Turkey would be willing to send troops to Libya if Sarraj requested them. My thought was, as you just also pointed out, while Turkey's Syria offensive has effectively whipped up nationalist sentiment and boosted support for Erdogan, I doubt dispatching Turkish troops to fight in some distant civil war would get the same reaction. So I wonder, why is Erdogan willing to take this step?
Again, I think you look at the map and it's worrisome. I also think that Erdogan does have a political imperative. I mean, he does, the operation in Syria certainly did boost his popularity, but he's still down his approval ratings and the AKP's approval ratings are still suffering. You have a potential fracturing of the party. Prominent people like Ali Babacan and Ahmed Davutoglus are establishing political parties that could shave as many as 1 million votes off of the AKP and further fracture the party. So I think Erdogan is desperate to demonstrate himself as a leader, something that I think resonates across the political spectrum, but in particular with his core constituency, which is now being threatened from within. Again, but you cannot dismiss the kind of strategic rationale and the way in which folks in Ankara must be looking at the maps right now. And there's another thing, and I know, David, you've been watching Turkey for a long time. I'm a bit older than you. But weirdly, Turkish Islamists kind of have this weird yen for Libya. I don't know where you are, but I remember when Necmettin Erbakan made his first foreign visit as prime minister in the mid-1990s, and it was to Tripoli to visit Muammar Gaddafi. It wasn't to Brussels. It wasn't to Paris. It was to Tripoli. It was sort of a weird situation. So and then, of course, the AKP government was deeply involved in Libya in building infrastructure for Gaddafi. But so there is something going on there that has brought Turkish Islamists to Libya.
As General Khalifa Haftar's forces close in on the Turkey-backed government in Tripoli, some observers are envisioning a repeat of Syria and expect Russia and Turkey to reach some sort of agreement to halt the fighting. And in fact, the Turkish security delegation is supposed to meet with Putin tomorrow to discuss Libya. What's your view on that? Might there be a deal in the offing?
Well, I don't know. Syria and Libya are two different situations. And I think that the Turks have a case to be made on Syria that they don't have a case to be made on Libya. And keep in mind that what the Russians are interested in Libya is its proximity to Europe, its natural resources. It has the largest reserves of light sweet crude in the world. It has the fourth largest deposits of gas in all of Africa. And I urge you and listeners to Talking Turkey to take a look at the map and look at where the Russians have established influence around the region. And what it is it's this Mediterranean strategy to kind of squeeze Europe. Confusion in Europe to demonstrate Russia's influence in and around Europe. And it strikes me that the Libya play is part of that and is too seemingly important to the Russian strategy to take account of whatever Turkish concerns there are about supporting Sarraj. So whereas they may have come to some sort of agreement on Syria, I think it's going to be harder for the Turks to make the case. Because it's part of a Russian grand strategy. I'm not a Russia expert, and I think a lot of Russia experts would fight with me about this. But I do see it seems sometimes it takes an outsider to kind of to put it all together. And I'm certainly not the only person who has articulated this, but it does seem to me that the Russians have a grand strategy in the Mediterranean, and whatever presentations the Turks make to the Russians on what their interests and what some sort of deal on Libya may not, I don't know for sure, but may not get as serious a hearing as Turkish concerns in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Syria, you recently visited the Bardarash refugee camp outside Dohuk, Iraq, where some 15,000 Syrian refugees, mostly Kurds, I think, are said to have fled following Turkey's offensive in northeast Syria. Please tell us a little bit about your visit. How are the Syrian refugees doing there? And do they have anything to say about Turkey's offensive?
Well, just to clarify, I think the number that the UNHCR told us was 10,000 in Bardarash, but there's 18,000 total Syrian refugees who are new arrivals after Operation Peace Spring. Mm-hmm. They don't look. If not for UNHCR and its local partners in these camps, things would be far tougher than they are, and they're very, very tough. I visited on a rainy day, cold day. Was muddy in the camp. They're just building a school for the large numbers of children there. There is medical care, but it's basic. Shelters are tents with kerosene or sometimes electric heaters. I spoke with a number of the refugees there who are obviously in not good shape. It's ostensibly an open camp, but Kurdish security is very concerned about ISIS infiltrators, so it's very hard for Syrians to get outside of the camp. But it was heartbreaking. I actually was able to sit down and talk with a family inside their tent. They fled Turkish airstrikes in Kamishli to make it across the border in October. This is a gentleman seemed to be in his mid-30s. He had with him his 5-month-old daughter, his wife, his mother, his 2 siblings who were in their 20s, both of whom were physically and mentally disabled, as well as their neighbor, a widow. He was responsible for all of these people. They spent significant sums getting all these folks across the border because the YPG is not wanting people to come across the border, and they're closing the border. So either people are paying the YPG to get across the border or paying smugglers to get across the border. So that this refugee set, this 18,000 people, are relatively better off because they have an ability to pay to get across the border, but still they're living in desperate straits. They are trying, this family, it was heartbreaking. I met the siblings, I met the mother, I met the neighbor. They're all there in this tent. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And the medical facilities in Bardarash don't have the medications that that the siblings need. And so they're desperately trying to move to Erbil where they can get the medical care that they can get. But these two siblings, they can't even move around this camp. The mud was, almost ankle deep.
Were they cursing Turkey, or were they just dealing with their situation?
Well, they were dealing with their situation, but obviously fleeing Turkish airstrikes can't endear them to the Turks. My sense was that they were so focused on dealing with their own situation that, of course they laid blame on everybody, but they were particularly concerned with how they were going to get along. He had borrowed some money from someone else in the camp to open a small shop. That's one of the things that's actually going on in these camps. It's quite extraordinary. People have opened, little ba'els and shawarma stands, and they're trying to get by that way as a kind of stopgap before they can go and find some work in and around Duhok or other places. Like I said, it's an open camp. I tell you, one of the other interesting stories was not from the Bardarash refugee camp, but in the town Sununi, where at the base of Mount Sinjar, where we met Yazidis, who said, we asked, well, who do you trust? And they said the PKK, given the fact that the PKK came to the rescue on the mountain after the ISIS onslaught. And they also were relating to us their concerns that Turkey's proxies in the invasion in Syria are now also abusing Yazidis in ways, that would constitute war crimes. Now, there's no way to... In
Iraq or in Syria?
In Syria.
Okay. And
that there's this effort to rescue Yazidis from both of from these conflicts. It's hard to know what to make of those accusations without any hard evidence or documentation from international organizations. But it was really it's hard. I haven't written about it. It's hard to articulate the desperation and degradation of some people in Iraq these days. And I include the people in the Bardarash refugee camp, even though they started out as relatively better off. Certainly, without the UN, it would be medieval. People would not have the food, the shelter, or even the medical care, as basic as all of these things are, without UNHCR, without UNICEF, without UNDP, and a variety of other, and their local partners.
Speaking of the area they fled, Erdogan co-chaired a UN forum on refugees this week and said Turkey still aims to resettle at least 1 million of the Syrian refugees in Turkey in that area. He called for using Syrian oil to fund the construction of new settlements. I wonder what you think of that idea, and also just generally, do you see Erdogan getting this 26 billion or so he needs to fund this massive construction project?
I think this is the kind of, look, one of the things that spurred Operation Peace Spring was Erdogan's domestic politics. And just a short number of years ago, and your listeners must know that the Turks were touting how they had welcomed 3.5 million Syrian refugees and cared for them and spent all this money. And then Erdogan lost the Istanbul mayor, his party lost the Istanbul mayor election twice. And the opposition has been calling for moving Syrians back into Turkey as Turkey's economy has faltered. And Erdogan has now taken up this issue. I see this as really as domestic politics. I don't see how he's going to get $26 billion. I think that it was, a stunning irony that he appeared at this meeting and said, as an advocate for refugees, this is contrast that to the way people are experiencing the world, especially from the Bardaras refugee camp. It really makes a mockery of his claims. They will have to use force to move people back into these places, and I don't see how, especially places where they don't come from, I don't see how they're going to accomplish that.
It's a good transition to domestic politics. As you mentioned before, former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglus officially launched his future party last week, bizarrely choosing Friday the 13th to do so. And he vowed in his speech to end Erdogan's presidential system. But back in June, you argued in a piece for Politico that Davutoglus is not the politician to save Turkey. I wonder why not. And I wonder if you think that maybe Davutoglus and Babacan could together change the electoral map.
Why not? First, let me just give a shout out to my co-author on that piece, Sinan Ciddi, who's a terrific Turkey analyst in his own right. I think that the point of that piece was in response to some of the good international press that Davutoglus had gotten around that time when he first started floating the idea of creating his own party. And we wanted to set the record straight about what his record was as the prime minister, which was basically implementing much of what the kind of deepening of Erdogan's authoritarianism. When just one example, when Davutoglus first became the prime minister, Turkey its record on press freedoms was not great, but by the time he was essentially fired, he had overseen Turkey becoming the leading jailer of journalists in the world, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, which I think is a pretty solid source. But at the same time, I think the most important part of your question is, could the combination of Davutoglus and Babacan change Turkey's electoral map? And I think that that's entirely possible. I think Davutoglus does have a constituency. He likely has he's not a charismatic figure like Erdogan, of course. But I think that there have been fissures and fractures within the Islamist movement within Turkey, and that Erdogan is seen less as a kind of moral leader of the Islamist camp and more of an authoritarian. And that Erdogan articulates a vision that is, I think, closer to what, how the AKP originally viewed the world. And so I think that Davutoglus probably has a better chance of developing a constituency than, for example, Babacan. Although Babacan's chief patron is Abdullah Gül, who remains popular. But Babacan is more of, the technocratic class. I joked one day on Twitter that he could probably win Wall Street and a country I dubbed hedge fundia. Mm-hmm. But still, the combination of those two, combined with the cracks within the Islamist movement and fissures within the AKP that people have been talking about for at least the last 6 years, now at least those who have been having second thoughts about Erdogan have potential places to go. And as I said before, there's the possibility that the combination of Davutoglus and Babacan could shave, 1 million votes or more off of the AKP, and and members of the AKP can abandon the party for these new parties, which would make for a very, very interesting next electoral cycle. Which brings me to another issue, which is that I've been hearing over and over again that there's the possibility of early elections.
That I was going to ask.
Right. And so, as the kind of Western-based analyst, some of this doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because if you're Erdogan and you're relatively weak, and you don't have to call elections, you have 3 years to repair the economy, to undermine Davutoglus and Babacan.
Well, 4 really is scheduled for November 2023.
Right. Okay. And you have a lot of bide your time and build back some of the goodwill that you lost over the course of the last number of years.
Mm-hmm.
There's a counter argument that says, why not? You still have a large following. Why not strike while Davutoglus and Babacan are just getting organized, and they don't have any real organization behind them? And the CHP, despite the kind of important victory that Ekrem İmamoğlu staged in Istanbul to capture that city from Islamists for the first time since 1994, the CHP remains in disarray. So here would be a good moment. I stick to the former argument. It seems to me that Erdogan has time on his side, but I'm interested to hear from Turks. I'm looking forward to him having a conversation with a Turkish friend on Friday over coffee. I'm interested in hearing the logic behind the early election, because I'm open to the idea of it. I need to understand the logic behind it. It certainly would make for another interesting moment in Turkish politics. We all thought we had a break for a little while.
Mm-hmm. I'll finish up with a review of the year past and a look ahead. You've been a Turkey watcher for what, 15, 20 years?
Well, I've been at the Council on Foreign Relations for 15 years, but my formative experience in Turkey was doing dissertation research there in the early 2000s. So I guess it's a little bit longer than that. Okay. So, and my first visit to Turkey was in October 1992.
Okay, so we could almost say a quarter century even. So have relations between the U.S. and Turkey ever been this bad? And why? Is it Erdogan, the S-400? Is there some broader divergence?
Right. It's a terrific question, David. And let me say, I don't remember 1974. So, people will say, oh, this is the worst crisis since 1974. Look, at least since I've been working on Turkey and studying Turkey and visiting Turkey, this seems to be the worst crisis. Now, let's also keep in mind that the way in which Turkey has often been discussed until relatively recently in Washington has been with a kind of rose-colored glasses and the romance of a Cold War victory, papering over the difficulties in the relationship, like 1974, like the arms embargo, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly since I've been working on Turkey, this is the most significant deterioration in relations. I tend to not blame it on Erdogan. People think that I'm, this kind of like crazy Erdogan hater. I actually think he's a fascinating political character. I wouldn't want to live in Turkey under Erdogan. But I think that it's structural. The thing that really held Turkey and the United States together was the Cold War, the common perception of threat we felt about the Soviet Union, and that successive efforts to find some kind of grand project for the two countries to cooperate on have met with limited success. And so Turkey, wanting to be a power in its own right, and not just an asset to the United States or an asset to NATO on its southeastern flank, is pursuing its interests in ways that aren't necessarily consistent with American interests. And I'm not necessarily convinced that this is just an Erdogan problem. I certainly think that if there was some other leader, maybe some of the issues would not be as great as they are in some areas. Certainly, I don't think, the CHP leadership would have been welcoming Islamists from Egypt to delegitimize another strategic ally of the United States, Egypt. But I do think that there would be significant differences between the United States and Turkey over Syria. I think there would be significant differences over Cyprus, over the Aegean. They may not be as intense as they were, but it would, if that were the case, if we were in that world, I would be writing that the two countries are actually going in different directions in a similar way that I've talked about it now. Now you add the personality of Erdogan into this, and it adds another interesting dynamic to it. But I think that we all need to sit back and recognize that at a time when President Erdogan is no longer Turkey's leader, things will not return to some sort of constructive normal between the two countries. I think there's a lot of mistrust between the political elite in the two countries, and a congressional recognition of Armenian genocide. Not saying that was the wrong thing to do, but only deepens the mistrust among the elites between the two countries. I keep hearing, and this will be my last point, that at least 50% of the population doesn't support Erdogan. But I think it's an analytic leap to suggest that those 50% do support and are willing to defend a close U.S.-Turkey relationship. I'm willing to believe that some percentage of that group of 50% that aren't Erdogan supporters do support a strong U.S.-Turkey relationship, but I'm not convinced that it's the full 50% by any stretch of the imagination.
Mm-hmm. The last one for you. So with the S-400s coming online soon, sanctions on the way probably, as well as a major Hulk bank fine, it seems unlikely that U.S.-Turkey relations will recover in 2020. But Trump is now facing impeachment as well as an election next year. I wonder if you think that might impact Turkish relations and also the possibility of a new U.S. president.
Oh, well, certainly. Look, I think as far as impeachment goes and a re-election campaign, I think it'll mostly be status quo in the U.S.-Turkey relationship. I don't think that the president, who's really been driving the policy, because I can count probably 4 people in Washington who don't want to sanction Turkey, and the president is one of those 4, and he's the most important, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think to the extent that his attention is focused on his re-election and fighting impeachment, there's going to be not a lot of change in U.S.-Turkey policy unless something extraordinary happens or the Congress takes some measure to really force the administration's hand. But keep in mind that the majority leader, I think, shares the sentiments of his colleagues that Turkey's behavior is, from their perspective, beyond the pale. But he doesn't want to get out ahead of the president. So that is a break on significant efforts to try to force the administration's hand on Turkey. As far as the new president goes, as I said earlier, this is the one thing that seems to be bipartisan in Washington these days, is that the relation that the United States needs to answer what lawmakers and people like myself see as Turkey's divergence from the United States and willingness to, at the very least and most diplomatically, complicate American efforts, mostly in the Middle East, but elsewhere.
Okay. Stephen A. Cook, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thanks so much. This has been a lot of fun.